The wind carried the cold down the slopes long before the sun rose, sweeping over the frost-covered pines like the breath of something ancient. The silence in the valley was deep and undisturbed, until it wasn't. It began as a single howl, high, sharp, distant. Then another. Then two more. Within seconds, the mountain echoed with the cries of wolves, not scattered, not disordered, but perfectly aligned, a chorus of instinct and warning that rose into the dawn like a war song. It wasn't the howl of hunger, nor of territory. It was something else entirely. At the ranger outpost below the eastern ridge, Jonah Keller dropped his coffee and turned toward the sound. His radio was silent, but the tremor in the glass windows was not. The howls vibrated through the air with a pressure that was physical, like the mountain itself was listening. He stepped outside, breath turning to fog, and scanned the tree line. Then he saw them. 5 wolves, each dark as shadow, standing in a perfect line along the ridgeline above. Still, tails low, heads raised to the sky. Their howling ended abruptly, all at once, as if silenced by command. And then, the rumble began. It wasn't sharp, like a quake. It was slow, low, rolling through the earth like the belly of something impossibly large shifting in its sleep. Birds exploded from the trees, icicles broke loose from cliffs above and shattered in the ravine. Keller staggered back, nearly slipping on the frozen steps, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the sensation that this was not natural. The mountain had heard the wolves, and it had answered. The tremor faded as quickly as it had begun, but it left behind a silence too heavy to be normal. Jonah stood motionless, eyes on the ridge where the wolves had just been. Now there was nothing. No movement, no wind. Even the clouds above had stilled, as if waiting. He radioed headquarters. Static tried again. Still nothing. He wasn't surprised. Whatever that was, it had knocked something out. Inside the cabin, he grabbed his pack, clipped the seismograph reader to his belt, and stepped back out. He had to get higher. Whatever caused that tremor wasn't on the surface, but the wolves had sensed it before it hit. That wasn't chance. That was warning. By midday, Jonah had climbed halfway up the western face, cutting through drifts of snow, untouched by anything but wind. The forest thinned here, pine trunks giving way to spiny rock and moss-streaked boulders. The wolves' prints were still visible, fresh, clustered in places where they had gathered in a circle, then fanned out like scouts sent from a council. He knelt to inspect them. Each paw was perfectly outlined in the snow, and something else caught his attention. A thin crack running under one of the prints. Hairline, almost invisible. He brushed the snow away. The crack widened as it traced into the mountainside, vanishing beneath a cluster of exposed roots. It wasn't a surface fracture. It ran deep. Jonah switched on the seismic reader. The screen flickered, then began streaming erratic numbers. Spikes, lulls, but all in rhythm, like a heartbeat. He swallowed hard. This wasn't a rockfall warning. This wasn't post-quake activity. This was prelude. Behind him, a faint sound echoed through the trees. Crunch, not wind, not animal. Footsteps. He turned and froze. Just beyond the tree line, a single wolf stood on the rise watching him, taller than he expected. Fur gray and ragged with winter, eyes like polished iron. It didn't snarl, didn't move, just stared. And after a long moment, it turned and walked into the trees, slow and purposeful, like it expected him to follow. Jonah did, because something in that gaze made the mountain itself feel suddenly smaller than the truth hiding beneath it. The wolf moved like smoke through the thinning woods, never running, never looking back, but always staying just close enough for Jonah to follow. Snow crunched beneath his boots, and his breath hung in front of him in tight, ragged clouds. Higher up, the terrain changed again. Trees gave way to jagged ledges and dark clefts in the rock where frost clung like moss. And still the wolf ascended, stepping over cracks that had not been there last year, skirting ledges that now hung looser than memory allowed. Jonah followed against instinct, against protocol. But something in him knew this was not disobedience. It was survival. The wolf stopped near a wind-blasted ridge and stood staring across a narrow ravine. On the other side was something strange, a gouge in the slope, not caused by erosion, but fresh and deep, like the mountain had peeled itself open. The snow inside the gouge had melted into steam. The ground around it was scorched black. Jonah stepped to the edge and peered down. It wasn't a landslide. It was a vent, narrow but deep, extending so far into the rock that his flashlight beam didn't catch the bottom. Warm air pushed upward, unnaturally warm. There was a smell, too. Not sulfur exactly, but old, dead minerals. The kind you smell only when the deep earth breathes. He took out his seismic reader. It blinked red. Numbers jumped erratically. But what made him go still wasn't the readings. It was the sound. A low, rhythmic thump, deep and distant, like the pulse of something massive shifting far below. A pressure wave, not yet violent, but growing. The wolf growled softly, not at him, at the sky. And that's when Jonah realized the air had changed again. Clouds gathered overhead, pulling into unnatural spirals. The kind of patterns you see in satellite footage before something gives way. The wolf turned and vanished into a stand of trees. Jonah wanted to chase it, but the ground beneath him lurched, not a violent shake, but a slow, tilting roll, like the mountain was stretching itself. A crack opened beneath his right boot, and he jumped back just as the edge of the ravine dropped a few inches and stayed there. He radioed again, still static. Then, the howling returned. Not a scattered cry, but a unified chorus, echoing off every ridge and crag. And this time, Jonah heard the pattern clearly. They weren't warning each other. They were marking time. The air hung thick with pressure, the kind you feel before a thunderclap, but there were no clouds heavy enough to explain it. Jonah stood at the edge of the gouged vent, the wolves' synchronized howls still echoing through the ridges above and below. Their voices moved in coordinated waves now, rising and falling like ocean swells, as if they were singing not to the forest, but to the mountain itself. He stepped back from the broken earth and scanned the tree line, heart hammering. Not one wolf in sight, but they were everywhere, surrounding him in sound. He descended the slope with purpose now, sliding across loose shale and powder, retracing his steps. It was no longer about curiosity. It was a question of how much time was left. When he reached the first pine cluster, he saw something that stopped him cold. Claw marks, dozens of them, etched deeply into tree bark, circling a wide section of forest. Each was cut at the same height. Deliberate. Not a scuffle. A boundary. A boundary around what? Jonah moved past them, pushing deeper into the grove, and there it was. An ancient stone formation half buried beneath moss and snow. It looked like a collapsed well at first, but the stones were too uniform. Carved, aligned in concentric rings, their centers blackened with soot and time. In the middle, a narrow vertical crack, the same kind he'd seen above, only this one had burnt edges. He crouched beside it. The snow around the stones had melted. The earth here was warm to the touch, as if something beneath had only recently awakened. He ran a gloved hand across the edge, brushing off dirt, and saw something etched beneath. Symbols. Not letters, not numbers. Warnings. Behind him, a low growl. Jonah turned slowly. A wolf, not the gray one, but white, massive, its coat rippling like snow turned to muscle. It stepped forward from the shadows. But it didn't attack. Instead, it circled the structure and sat beside it, eyes on Jonah, unmoving. He understood. This was not just geology. This was history. Something buried long before maps, before towns, maybe even before people. The wolves weren't reacting to danger. They were guarding it. And whatever lay beneath the mountain, pulsing and hot and growing restless, was older than anyone alive. And it was rising. By the time Jonah reached the northern slope, the sun had dipped behind a wall of darkening clouds casting the forest in amber gloom. The howls had stopped. Not faded, stopped, as if silenced all at once. He should have been relieved by the quiet, but instead, it pressed against his chest like a weight, the kind of silence that warns just before something breaks. He reached the overlook where he'd left an old signal repeater months ago, a rusted metal box wedged into the rock. It was dead, lights cold, the antennae bent from some recent wind or force. But when Jonah touched it, the static came to life in his ear. Not a voice, not a signal. A sound. Low, rhythmic, like breathing from beneath the ground. He froze. That wasn't interference. That was pressure venting. He swept the ridge with his binoculars, scanning for movement. And there, along a higher crest, the wolves. All of them. Dozens, standing in rows, facing the summit. Perfectly still, their bodies silhouetted against the sky. Not hunting, not patrolling. Watching. He followed their gaze and saw the first plume. It rose from the summit, slow, dark, and spiral-shaped, like a serpent unwinding from stone. No explosion, no fire, just release. Steam or gas, thick and ancient-smelling, crawled into the sky. Birds broke from the canopy below in sudden bursts, spiraling upward in blind panic. He'd seen gas venting before, but never in patterns. This wasn't random. The plume pulsed, like it too had a heartbeat. Behind him, footsteps. Not crunching snow, not boots. He turned fast. The white wolf again. Closer now, eyes locked with his. Behind it, two more. The gray from before, and a darker one, almost blue-black. They didn't threaten. They waited, as if they were measuring him, deciding. He didn't know how long he stood there, a man in borrowed territory, surrounded by something more ancient than maps and more exact than sensors. The gas plume widened, and the mountain exhaled again, this time with a tremor that knocked snow from the ledges and set birds screeching down the slopes. Jonah looked at the wolves, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He felt watched, and possibly, though he couldn't yet prove it, protected. Night fell without stars. The sky above the mountain had turned an ashen gray, heavy with smoke and unseen currents that twisted unnaturally through the air. Jonah had made camp in a shallow alcove near the ridge, though he hadn't slept. He sat with his back to the rock, flashlight dimmed, eyes fixed on the summit, watching the slow, relentless rise of vapor, as if the mountain was bleeding time itself into the sky. The wolves had not returned, but their presence hadn't left. He could feel it in the pressure of the woods, in the way no other creatures stirred. Not a deer, not an owl, not even the usual rustle of rodents beneath the snow. Nature had pressed pause, holding its breath for something it knew was already in motion. At 2:17 a.m., the seismic reader on his belt woke up again. It had been silent since sunset. Now it blinked red, then white, then red again. No patterns, just pulses. Like stress signals in code. He flipped it around, checked the signal feed, and saw a wave pattern that didn't make sense. Not a quake. Not a tremor. A warning. His radio clicked. Just once. A single burst of static. Then the ridge beneath him shifted. Not violently, but with intent. Like a long, buried hinge unlocking. A fissure just a few meters away cracked open with a muted pop, releasing a thin stream of glowing dust. Not light, but something phosphorescent, rising like embers from a slow fire buried in stone. It wasn't lava. It wasn't steam. It was older than both. Jonah stood backing away as the fissure widened an inch, then stopped. The dust rose steadily, shimmering as it caught what little ambient light remained. He held his breath, and for a terrifying moment, the entire world seemed to listen. Then, somewhere far below, something knocked. A single, dull thud. Deep. Hollow. Massive. Jonah dropped to one knee instinctively. It wasn't sound. It was a presence, a signal felt through the bones before the ears. And then, movement. The wolves appeared again, one by one. At first, their eyes glinting between trees, then their bodies stepping into view, surrounding the fisher, forming a silent ring. None looked at him. They looked down, down into the glow, down into whatever ancient system pulsed beneath the mountain's skin. Jonah realized then, this wasn't just a geological event. This was a memory waking up. And the wolves, they weren't just guardians. They were the mountain's messengers. The moment stretched, frozen in silence except for the soft hiss of rising dust. Jonah stood just beyond the circle of wolves, heart thudding in rhythm with the deep pulses vibrating through the mountain. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there, minutes, hours, maybe longer, but the air had changed. It had grown heavier, denser, as if time itself was thickening. And still the wolves stood unmoving, their eyes locked downward, ears perked toward a sound Jonah could no longer hear, but still somehow felt. Then the ground exhaled. Not a tremor, not a quake, but a slow, sighing motion that passed through the stones and trees like a breath long held. The fissure widened. From it came no flame or ash. Instead, a single column of amber-colored mist unfurled upward, twisting like smoke in slow motion. It shimmered faintly, alive with particles that danced like insects, but didn't touch the ground. Jonah reached a hand toward it, but stopped when the wolves growled, low and unified, a sound of warning and finality. And then it happened. The mist condensed, tightened, and rose faster. Above, the clouds split open in absolute silence. A pillar of light burst into the sky, invisible except for how it bent the stars around it. The earth didn't shake. It hummed, deep and bone-born, like the ancient song of glaciers or tectonic plates. Every creature in the forest was still. The world had gone silent except for the mountain's voice. Jonah fell to one knee, not from pain, from something else. Reverence, the kind that breaks through even science. Because what he saw wasn't an eruption, it was an emergence. From the vent came no lava, no destruction. Instead, the cracks split further, and something massive stirred beneath the crust. Something alive, or something that had once lived and was now awakening in form alone. Jonah saw only glimpses, massive ridges like scales or stone, the suggestion of movement too slow to call walking, too purposeful to call collapse. The wolves howled once more, this time not in panic or warning, but in ritual. Their voices rose in perfect harmony, filling the forest, echoing off every rock and ridge. And then, just as quickly, they fell silent and disappeared one by one, fading into the trees, their purpose fulfilled. The mountain settled. The light collapsed into itself, folding like silk and vanishing into the earth. The mist cleared. The fissure sealed. And Jonah was left kneeling in the snow, in a clearing that was suddenly ordinary again, except for the warmth that lingered in the ground beneath him, and the faint pattern of paw prints burned gently into the rock. He didn't speak of it later, not in full. The data he brought down was corrupted, the recordings blank, but the story etched itself into him, deep and permanent. A truth he couldn't prove, but couldn't deny. And high above, hidden deep in the peaks, the wolves still watched, waiting, in case it ever stirred again.